Welcome, everyone. Hopefully to a little lengthier session on things every child with autism wishes you knew. My name is Keith Pentz. I am an early years program consultant. I live in Sarasota, Florida, and it's my privilege to get to present today on this particular topic, and doing another session later on development with body, brain, and mind. My background is primarily the classroom. I have 18 years experience in the classroom. I worked with infants and toddlers. I taught preschool for many years. I've taught kindergarten and lower elementary. I also was a college professor for 6 years and worked as an assistant professor of early childhood education. Beyond that, I worked for many years with Kaplan Early Learning Company as a professional development specialist. And most recently, I have been involved in my own consulting business. The subject for today is things every child with autism wishes you knew. And what I intend to do is highlight some pieces that come particularly from the work of Ellen Nottbaum, who wrote a book, and it's like its third iteration now, called 10 Things Every Child with Autism Wishes You Knew. I'll be borrowing from some of her work, as well as the work of Martha Herbert and some other researchers, as well as just some good practice and so on. One of the important things we need to remember when we're talking about autism is that we need to understand that we're coming at it from and the way we need to work with it is understanding that it's on a developmental continuum, and we need to recognize that. So I'm going to start with first a definition, and then start with some points that identify characteristics or things that may be factors in how a child gets placed on the autism spectrum, and then I will launch into the things specifically that we need to recognize and be able to understand in order to make better choices and decisions for those children, particularly in our care and in this particular time of the pandemic and so on, helping families that are dealing with issues at home, and perhaps giving them some guidance as well in how they can not just cope, but also to actually enhance their lives and so for their children. A brief definition of autism spectrum disorder, which we refer to as ASD from this point on. So if you see it on a slide, or if I refer to it, it may be just ASD. So you need to understand that. Autism spectrum disorder is a biologically based neurodevelopmental disorder that affects a child's behavior and social and communication skills. Let's break that down just briefly. Biologic, meaning it's the body, meaning it's who we are, our physiology and that sort of thing. It's neurodevelopmental, meaning that there's a significant component related to the brain and how the brain develops, matures, how the brain processes information. And notice it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning that the brain is not working or not functioning in the manner that it typically should, and so on for the person. Based on that biology and neurodevelopment and so on, the disorder, it's going to affect a child's behavior. In other words, we're going to see what either could be termed either inappropriate behaviors or developmentally delayed behaviors, or just all kinds of behavior issues, as well as social and communication skills. And we'll talk specifically about some of those along the way. So a very brief definition and so on. At this point in time in our history, approximately 1 in 59 children are being diagnosed with based on the spectrum. Notice we also use, we say the word spectrum, meaning that there are a variety of iterations of that. It's a continuum. And so not every child is going to be the same or respond the same. So not only are we unique individuals as humans, but children on the spectrum actually have unique characteristics as well. But 1 in 59 children is being diagnosed. We know that that number continues to seem to rise significantly. Just 20 years ago, we were identifying approximately 1 in 250. 10 years ago, it was about 1 in 150. And in the last few years, as many as 1 in 59. So we're seeing it. So, and the question often arises, why? Why are we having this increase? Well, a lot of the factors I'm going to be talking about are coming into play. And so when we take a look at some of these factors, you'll understand why we may be seeing an increase. It's not just that people are recognizing it, but it's that there actually is an increase in behaviors and body responses and so on, and how children are being impacted. Boys, males in particular, are 4 times more likely to be identified than girls. That's an ongoing fact. In the most recent research that I've heard, we are seeing an uptick in girls as well. These numbers may change. In fact, one presenter I heard at a conference last year said it's probably 3 to 2 at this point in time. But for right now, the literature seems to be maintaining this idea of boys are 4 times more likely than girls. We know that white children, Caucasian children, have a greater propensity. And a couple of the slides I'm going to show you here in a bit will help you understand why that is as well. White children are more often diagnosed than Black or Hispanic children. And so it's much more typical to see Caucasian children on the spectrum as they come into our programs and working with them. So why is that? Why these things? Well, we know that there's a direct link with autism and genes and the environment. In other words, our genetic makeup and the environment that we are coming from. Those genes, as they get expressed, may have mutations, and that comes as the cells are changed and so on too. So mutations, and so genetically, meaning from one generation to the next, if someone was identified early on, if you know a child, or if you have somebody in your family, or your family's been impacted by this as well, you can look back, 1, 2, 3 generations and take a look and see, did somebody else exhibit some of these characteristics that we're going to be talking about a little later, that perhaps there is this genetic component going on that it gets passed on. That's why if there is a predisposition, or there was a predisposition in particularly a Caucasian or a white person, genetically, that is going to get passed down. So that's therefore why we see that. If that didn't exist in a Black or an Hispanic family, historic family, that's why it is not getting expressed now. And so we need to take all that into consideration. We also know that there is a component or a piece related to body health. How is the body feeling and so on? I'm going to be talking a little bit here. I realize we're at a preschool, a pre-K conference, and yet we need to understand what is going on pre-birth, during birth, and then with very, very young children, in order to also help us make better informed choices and decisions. Body health early on, meaning with infants, is also a significant factor in whether or not a child eventually gets placed on the autism spectrum. The work of Martha Herbert, as I mentioned, from Harvard, Martha talks about specifically about inflammations and how that young children, meaning babies and very young toddlers, who experience excessive inflammations, meaning lots of ear infections, lots of tummy troubles, lots of bowel issues. And the doctor doesn't seem to know what to do. So the doctor just, the pediatrician just sort of feeds the child antibiotics and hasn't run necessarily all the tests that possibly could be run and so on. What happens is body health becomes an issue. And that plays into the brain, because what is happening in the body is sending signals to the brain. In other words, if the body has inflammation, it's sending pain signals. When we know that when we are in pain, that that's not going to stimulate the part of the brain where we have what we refer to as higher mental functions or executive functions. But what's going to happen is the triggers are going, or the wiring is actually going to trigger the brainstem. It's called survival. So the young child is struggling with dealing with pain, and rather than quote unquote learning, the brain is not developing and maturing and so in the way that it possibly can or should. And so the child is responding in a survival method rather than in a learning type of environment. The brain processes, as I said, information. The brain is processing the information coming in. So if there's something that's irritating the child and beyond inflammations, as we'll talk about, sometimes it's sensory data and information. Maybe something, the child is highly sensitized to something, be it touch, visual, auditory, all those factors. If the child is sensitized to those, either hyper or hyposensitized, then what happens is that the brain is processing information in a not what we would consider a traditional or a truly positive developmental mode. And so, as I said, we start very, very young. So looking at these next couple slides, you'll see very, very young children, younger than what you are working with. But we need to take into consideration when we're doing intake. In other words, when we are finding out who a child is coming into our program, and especially if they've already been diagnosed or if they are exhibiting characteristics that I'm going to be addressing, if there are things that seem to be an issue, we need to understand where those came from. Did the child have that early on? And if the child experienced some of these things early on, how are we going to deal with it? Because it's going to have to change how we interact with the child and what our plans are. So we think about how does the child process information? Thinking. We think about how does the child feel? How does the child react in an environment? How does the child attend? And what we mean by attend here is pay attention to something. We know that right now that the research is there's a greater interest in research of very, very young children. We're looking at children as young as 6 months of age and looking at how well they have what we refer to as joint attention or making eye contact and so on. And we know that if that is missing early on, as early as 6 months, that there is a greater propensity or greater likelihood that could be a contributing factor, not the only contributing factor, but a contributing factor to the child being placed on the autism spectrum, which also basically is about communicating and relating. How does the child communicate early on? How did the baby respond? Was the baby a fussy baby? As I said before, was the baby, did the baby suffer from inflammations and illness and so on? How did the relationship get maintained? Children who are disassociated from family members, a lack of relationship building, and so on. We see this especially now during the COVID time, that what we're noticing is that very young children, babies in particular, parents are either being very attentive, or we're also seeing the exact opposite, which is problematic. We know that relationships, back to that social and emotional development, can also be a critical factor, especially if a child has a predisposition to something, be that genetic or otherwise. So as we start talking, we start by thinking about, who is this child with autism? It's not something that just happened. In other words, there are contributing factors. And so while the image I have here on the screen shows a very young child, it's not, that is, in your case, as you're working with preschool, that's why it's so important to understand, where's the child coming from? What were the factors that influenced this child, get this child where he or she happens to be? And so I'm going to start talking about some of the factors that Nussbaum talks about, and elaborate on those, as well as expand on some of what she addressed. Ellen Nussbaum, as I said, wrote the book. Her son was placed on the spectrum, and so she has been quite instrumental in helping people to grasp and understand better about her reflections on how her son, and as her son is an adult now, and he's been able to communicate back to her about things that he wishes, that she would have understood better, or that other people can understand, and therefore influence how we work with children on the spectrum. First thing is, I am a whole child. My autism is part of who I am, not all of who I am. In other words, it's why we do not refer to as an autistic child. Autism is just a factor. So it's a child with autism. We could say, in my case, I'm a 66-year-old man. It defines me, or I could say I'm a man who is 66 years old. And so, you gives you a different kind of connotation when we think about that. I have blue-gray eyes. It's characteristic, but it's not all of who I am. And so we need to understand that when we are talking about a child, we need to understand that the autism is part of who they are, not all that they are. And so if you think about before today, what were your preconceived ideas that you often associate with the word autism? You're going to learn some stuff today that hopefully is going to change some of those notions. It's going to change some of your preconceived ideas. Maybe I've already said something that has helped you to understand a little bit more about why a child has been diagnosed, why a person that you know and work with, or that you see out in the community, that you work with, that they exhibit autistic characteristics. We have a grocery store here in Florida that tends to hire, you may have it in Utah as well. We have a grocery store that tends to hire persons who are on the spectrum. And it's quite interesting. Working, be they cashiers, be they people who fill the bags, people who clean the carts, whatever. It is fascinating as I walk into the grocery store and interact with the people. I'm constantly picking up on, what did I think before I knew what I know now? What did I think about was wrong with these people, or using that term loosely, wrong? But now I understand, hey, it's not that they have something wrong with them. It's just, oh, this is how they function in society, and I need to understand that and be more empathetic myself. My senses are out of sync. Now, taking a look at the illustration, once again, here we're back to a picture of an infant. It's so important to find out how did a baby respond, in those early years. And then as they move into your preschool classroom, how are they responding? And so if the baby was, I used these terms earlier, hypersensitive or hyposensitive, you can find that out from the parent. In other words, when the parent, took care of the child, were there things that happened? Were there certain touches that irritated the child? Were there certain, clothing items that irritated the child? Were there textures the child had difficulty learning to eat? Were there smells that made the child go crazy and that sort of thing? The senses many times get out of whack because the brain in the child who's on the spectrum, the brain, as I said, neurodevelopmentally, it hasn't been wired the way that we typically would think that it ought to be wired. And so those children who respond with a hypersensitivity, meaning that certain things just seem to tick them off, and that shouldn't be. A simple example I often use is that in a classroom, we're going to many times we're going to have a sand and water area. Well, we think as adults and as teachers and consultants and that sort of thing, we think, oh, that's a great thing. Children need to have access to a sand and water table. But for a child who's on the autism spectrum, that sand may actually be an irritant. It may actually cause them to become hyper aroused because it does not feel comfortable on their skin. And so therefore they may act out as a response to that. When I was teaching, I had one little girl who, yes, it was a girl in this particular case, one little girl on the spectrum who eating solid food was an irritant. We had to make sure that all her food was pureed and that she used a straw to take in her food consumption, because what the doctor said was that more than likely the solid food irritated the roof of her mouth. He said it was probably like hundreds of pins sticking into the top of her mouth. So she was hypersensitized to that. We also know that sometimes children are hyposensitized. What does hyposensitivity mean? It means the child may appear to be lethargic or tuned out, or just does not respond as we typically would think that they ought to. So when we think about that, think of the setting that you bring children into. Think of the setting. What are the visual stimuli that might upset a child? What are the tactile stimuli? Where might a sensory overload occur in your particular classroom environment? We as early childhood teachers, we think, oh, we have to have lots of pretty and lots of stuff and whatever. And I've learned over the years, and as I especially as I took some influence from Reggio Emilia and from some other programs, that our rooms can be, quote unquote, stripped down a little bit, and that sensory overload doesn't have to occur. It's also why we know that while Screen time, and I realize screen time now in light of everything that's virtual is really interesting. But we know that too much screen time for young eyes can actually be detrimental physically as well as socially and emotionally. However, we know that for children who are on the autism spectrum, many times screens actually are advantageous because the screen takes the three-dimensional world and places it into a two-dimensional world. And therefore, it's that lack of other external stimuli that is actually a comfort to the child. So whether a child is hyper or hyposensitive, we consider that. Distinguish between won't and can't. That's a huge one, as far as I'm concerned. For a child who's on the spectrum, is it a matter that they are unable to do something, or is it they are choosing not to do something? Many times, it's more that they actually are unable to do something. It's that can't, and that if we keep pushing them, that is where we start to see behavior issues start to arise as well. So think about ways that you might be able to determine whether or not a child is actually being manipulative, or if they truly are needing understanding. We recognize that they can't do something versus that they won't do something. And this applies to all children. That's sort of the cool thing in reading Nussbaum's book. I thought, oh, wow, these are things that we need to take into consideration for all children, and not just for children who happen to be on the spectrum. Children on the spectrum tend to continue on what we refer to as concrete thinking. They interpret language very literally. What we know is that the language centers in particular in the brain start to change over and switch over and do some different things when it comes to around age 2. So that's just prior to children coming to see you in preschool. Up until about around age 2, developmentally, the brain is working overtime in what we refer to as the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is where we tend to have emotional and relational development. A lot of that goes on there. Creativity, imagination, empathy, that socialization, all of that is sort of right hemisphere influence big time early on. Around age 2, the brain typically does a major shift, and that shift goes to what we refer to as the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere, a couple characteristics of the left hemisphere is that it tends to be much more literal and linear. So if we think of that, it's literal and linear in its processing of information. Many times, children who have experienced some of the things that happened prior to that I mentioned earlier, health-wise, genetic-wise, and that sort of thing, they are finally getting identified and placed on the spectrum sometime after age 2 or 3. But what has happened in the meantime is that the brain has not connected or wired the way that it's supposed to. And while we start with the right hemisphere, and then the left hemisphere comes online big time. Around age 2, at the same time the left hemisphere becomes somewhat dominant, the two hemispheres are supposed to start wiring, cross-wiring, or start wiring together so that it's not just about concrete thinking or literal linear thinking, but it's in tandem with all that stuff that happened prior to, meaning the emotional connections, the empathy, the imagination and creativity. Well, what we have found is that, and especially from Martha Herbert's work, is that brain images that they're doing on children who are around 3 or 4, what they're seeing is that at what should have happened at age 2, where those two hemispheres should have started crossing over and cross wiring, that there's a space there. In other words, that wiring has not occurred. And so therefore, as the brain switches or goes into quote unquote concrete thinking, the child gets stuck there because that cross wiring isn't going over, and those two things aren't happening. And so that's why we see and hear children on the spectrum who seem to be, who perseverate with language or concepts or ideas, have difficulty with different definitions of words, and so on. In other words, a word means one thing. It doesn't mean something else. An example I give many times is if we think of the word plant, P-L-A-N-T, plant, most people start with the idea, well, it's something green, it grows outside. And yet we know that plant has many, many other meanings. It could be a factory or a place where they make stuff. A plant could be a more idiomatic type of phrase. You plant an idea, or you plant your feet. A plant could be a spy. A plant, it just has so many other shades of meaning. And unfortunately, what happens many times on the autism spectrum is the brain gets stuck on one particular meaning. And so therefore, the child or the person has difficulty transitioning and understanding things. This also applies to very, very young children. It's the same process, that even though they may be cross-wiring early on, they learn singular definitions or singular conceptual ideas. My mother told me that when I was very, very young, that my grandfather's, when we went to my grandfather's farm, I saw a horse. Well, everything was an horse, O-R-S-E. And yet, when I saw a dog or a cat, anything that had a particular 4 legs and a tail became an horse. In other words, it was a generalization of a concept, very literal and so on. So think about idioms. Idioms are turns of phrases that we use with children. Walking feet, listening ears, keep your hands to yourself, all eyes on me. Those are things, particularly for very young children, or for children on the spectrum. Those are very difficult concepts to grasp. It's why we need to be much more literal and linear in our speech with children, especially children on the spectrum. We need to say things like walk in the hall rather than use walking feet. Or we need to say, look at me rather than all eyes on me. Or we need to say, stand with your hands touching the sides of your legs. Very direct and literal in the meaning and what we intend. So think about what idioms, metaphors, slang, puns, sarcasm, and so on that you often use, and how that may or may not be effective. And so we have to be cautious about that. Listen to all the ways I'm trying to communicate. Listening in this particular case is broader than just verbal or sound. Listen means looking at as well. So listen in a I just talked about idioms and so on, but listening in a much grander way of thinking about communication. I may not have all the words. In other words, we think that we're providing vocabulary and so on for children, but if children haven't internalized that vocabulary, and particularly children on the spectrum, that is going to be extremely difficult for them to communicate and to understand what we're doing. Think of 3 different ways that you can frequently communicate non-verbally. how do you communicate in nonverbal ways? I'm watching myself in my little screen here. I use my hands all the time. My hands become an extension of me. It's body language and that sort of thing. So my eyes also communicate. My facial expressions, are a means of communication. So think about different ways that we communicate, and just think children are communicating to us in all those as well as others. Children on the spectrum are very visually oriented. What we mean by that is that because the words sometimes are difficult or words get in the way, and we can say this for a lot of young children, it's why a visual schedule, visual expectations should be made very prominent in a classroom. If we're just talking or we're just saying something that may or may not be communicating. But because children, especially children on the spectrum, are very visually oriented, we want to make sure that they have that. So not just a schedule. When we talk about behavior, I've often said, I learned a great technique early on for cleanup in my classroom. And that was, I had 5 photographs I would put at the different centers. I'll use the block area as one example. The first photograph was the block area put to rights. In other words, it's how the block area is supposed to look. Second photograph was children walking into the block area, preparing to play there. The third image was children actually playing or creating and building something in the block area. Fourth picture was children putting things away. And the fifth photograph was the same as the first photograph. In other words, if they cleaned up, then this is what the area is supposed to look like. And so things like that help all children, but especially they help children who are on the spectrum be much more resilient, is one word we might use here, and other to being successful. Remember, it's not a matter of, I should say, it is a matter of deciding, is it won't or can't? Back to one of the things we talked about earlier. Now, so think about what are other visual supports that you could place in a classroom, or that you could actually suggest for parents at home. What are the visual supports that could be there and help children along? Build on what the child can do rather than what the child can't do. It was interesting in reading through some of the Utah state standards. In the very opening couple paragraphs of the Utah state standards that Jessica forwarded to me, this is one of the prominent things I picked up in one of those opening paragraphs. It talked about building on what a child can actually do. And I'm like, whoa, yeah, I'm going to be talking about that. So this notion, this idea of helping a child to be successful. All of us are looking to be more successful or unsuccessful. And so it's also very Vygotskian in the sense that you're scaffolding a child, you're helping a child along to do more of what they possibly can. And so look at what the skills the child does possess and maximize those skills rather than placing expectations on any child of things that they can't do. And so we want to build on the can rather than the can't. So think about how you're going to channel a child's strengths into opportunities. How are you going to build on what a child actually can do? And noticing those things and building upon it and making it work for the child. In the definition of autism that we looked at earlier, it talked about the difficulties with social and communicative strategies and so on. Children on the spectrum have difficulty with social interactions, partly because the lack of joint attention, that part of the brain that leads to empathy development and so on may have been curtailed due to either environmental factors. We talked about genetic factors that could play a part, um, uh, body health, that part of the brain out here, it's called the orbital frontal cortex, that's supposed to be developing by about age 2 and lays down the foundation for things like empathy and understanding the other. That part of the brain sometimes does not get wired properly and so on. And so we have to be aware of that. That is why children may have difficulty with social interactions. When I do behavior workshops, I often talk about, when we look at what we deem to be inappropriate behaviors, we need to understand why the behavior is occurring. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but it explains the behavior. And therefore, we can make better informed choices and decisions about what we're going to do and how we're going to apply information and help children to be more communicative and help them with social interactions and so on. We need to think about, so many times we teach social skills by rote, and that just isn't enough. That just isn't enough. We have to model that. Remember, it's back to the word thing and the picture thing, the visual thing. It's one thing to tell somebody to do something, but it's another thing to demonstrate it. And especially for young children, and especially children on the spectrum, we have to model that and model exactly what our expectations are, and think about it that way. This was one of the factors that I often thought back in my own classroom about identifying what triggers meltdowns. What triggers a meltdown in a child? How do we figure that out? Well, if you have video going on in your classroom, or if you have someone who can be an observer, maybe you have somebody just coming in to do some observations, try to look at those things that happen immediately before there is a meltdown, before the meltdown, and figure out, hey, if you don't want the meltdown to occur, you're going to stop that. You have control over that situation in your own classroom. And so you want to identify what triggers a child's meltdowns, look at the factors that, or the activities, or maybe the language, the sensory stimuli, all of that may trigger the meltdown, and think about how you're going to change that or modify that to help the child. So what triggers you? What triggers you? I know what triggers me. What triggers you? What do you do to avoid a trigger? What do you personally do to avoid a trigger? We all have triggers, and we all know that there are things that set us off. And so what do we do to avoid those things? Well, think about the young child who's in a quote unquote confined classroom, how they don't have the luxury that we may have to just leave or whatever we're going to do. And so we have to think about helping that child through their own meltdowns. And one of the last things that Not Mom talks about is about a thing called unconditional love. And she talks about, especially if you're a family member or you're a teacher and you're concerned about the children, it's about that unconditional love. And that means patience, patience, patience. And I think about that unconditional love. I happen to be a preacher's kid. Both my parents were fundamentalist ministers, and I grew up, hearing about, unconditional love, and it's been a factor in my own life to think about that with everyone, and it definitely, when it permeates your thinking. In other words, it's something that you learn. How are you going to demonstrate that? How are you going to demonstrate patience? How are you going to demonstrate unconditional love? Because any child, doesn't matter who the child happens to be, any child is going to respond much more to a positive environment, the brain, the body likes positive social interaction. That's a known fact. And so we do best in social situations. And so we are constantly striving for relationship. And so relationship requires unconditional love. It requires this, putting up with stuff sometimes. I've been married almost 42 years now, and I can honestly say, it, it hasn't all been great, but yet at the same time, we have made a commitment to each other, and we have made the effort. We've put in the effort that we're going to hang in there. And so you learn what ticks somebody off, and you avoid those things. And hopefully they learn what ticks you off, and they don't do those things either. And so as we think about that as adults and as people in our community, we need to share that unconditional love. What does unconditional love and care mean to you? Who do you care about, and how does that play out in your life as well? So if we put all this together, if we take and think about all the factors that can influence a child who's on the spectrum, or that we think might be on the spectrum, or will get placed on the spectrum. We need to think about, what's happened developmentally, how that may be disordered, what happened to that young child early in life. Are there genetic factors? We may not necessarily know those. People may not know if somebody in their history had demonstrated autistic-like characteristics. They may not know that. They either weren't diagnosed, or it was just passed off as eccentricity or something like that. So there's all these things we need to understand. But as I've alluded to a little bit too, I think that those of us who work with preschool, it's great for us to be able to have that input. So whether you are in a situation where you can have that input, finding out more about the child's history, the family history, without gaining too much information. I mean, we're not going to go out there and seek out all the nitty gritty nasty stuff either. But we want to have that option that we can find out a few additional details. Maybe that just means asking a few other questions, whatever those questions happen to be. That's going to help us. And then taking into consideration all the things that Not Mom, as well as I suggested, all those factors to think about with the child. What are the things that are characteristics that we need to identify? How does the child respond to situations? Are there things that we can recognize as truly inappropriate behaviors, or are they just things that happen because the child is a child? And so we need to consider all that. I want to leave you with a quote from Loris Malaguzzi. Loris Malaguzzi was one of the founders of the Reggio Emilia schools. As I indicated, I've had the good fortune of traveling to Reggio several times to study. And the idea of nothing without joy, doing everything that we can without joy. And that means even when a child seems to give us difficulties, or we're frustrated ourselves, or whatever, think about, what can I do to make this better? Where is the joy? I was reading a devotional book toward the end of 2020, and toward the end of the book, they put out another quote in there that I found to be quite comforting, to put it mildly. And I was thinking big time about classrooms, and the quote was simply this: today, consciously look for the extraordinary amidst the ordinary. Today, consciously look for the extraordinary amidst the ordinary. And it made me think about this quote about nothing without joy, and just looking for the things that are positive and best for children in our care. Here's my personal contact information. If you have questions, if you have whatever, unfortunately, we don't have the time to really entertain a whole lot of that today, but if you have questions or you want more resources or information or research data and so on, I'm more than happy to provide that for you. You'll see my cell phone number there, both of my email addresses, my personal email as well as my work email. I have uploaded, uh, hopefully that went into the system, a handout for this particular session. It goes over some of the characteristics and it goes in a little more detail on some of the things, highlighting certain points and so on that you may wish to take a look at too. I want to thank you all very, very much for your participation. Hopefully you learned something and that it's going to be beneficial for you as you work with children in your care. Thank you very much.